Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. Hersh Goldberg-Polin was an American citizen and an Israeli citizen who was severely wounded during the 10/7 pogrom in Israel. And he was kidnapped by the Hamas terrorists that day. He was brutally wounded and he was tortured and starved in his captivity. He was murdered at the end of August 2024. He had endured barbaric cruelty. He had been starved. He was the face of the hostages for many Americans, and his parents, Jon and Rachel, join me today. Jon, I'm honored to meet you. Rachel, I wish I was talking to you again for the second time in other than a time of mourning for you, but I thank you both for coming out to speak about the hostages who remain, who include at least 2 Americans who are alive. There are 76 hostages, either living or dead, in Israel. I saw your message yesterday, and I think President Trump saw it too. Jon, let me begin with you. What did you make of the president's ultimatum to Hamas yesterday after you two put your message out?
Well, first of all, we again thank President Trump and Mr. Witkoff because things had been stuck, totally stuck for something like 450 days. And they went to work quickly, and whatever it is that they did, they worked their deal-making prowess and pulled out the cork that had everything stuck. So thank you, first of all, for getting things moving. In terms of the message, we appreciate very much President Trump pushing parties in the region hard to accelerate the deal. We saw on Saturday, we learned 165 days ago of the conditions when Hersh, who's 6 feet tall, came out dead, bullet-ridden at 115 pounds, and the other 5 taken out with him, all dead, were also all skeletal. So it's not new news, but the world got to see the condition of the hostages. And our point, and what we're really hoping Mr. President Trump will do, is accelerate this negotiated settlement. It's working, it's getting people out, and our plea is make it happen faster. There are 76 hostages left. Let's get them all out this weekend. And you mentioned at least 2 living Americans. There are 6 Americans still being held. So we just want to implore everybody to keep this deal on track, but accelerate it.
Rachel, the president did give an ultimatum yesterday. How did you react to that ultimatum? Because it looks to me, and I'm not an Israeli, I try and follow it, that the IDF is mobilizing in anticipation of Hamas saying no and not releasing 76 on Saturday.
Well, it's always hard to read in this region what is sort of hedging bets and being reactive and being theatrical and what is real. And we very much were played with during our 330 days of excruciating torment while we knew Hersh was being held. And I think that both sides are so skittish right now. And that's why we are imploring both sides, stay the course. This deal that President Trump and Mr. Witkoff have been able to get going is working. It's simply a question of it is taking too much time for everyone, I might add, not just for the hostages who still, by the way, are representing dozens of nationalities, and they are Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims being held still. But we also have to remember there are innocent Gazan people who are suffering. So both sides are suffering terribly, and it doesn't benefit the peoples on both sides for this to take such a long, extended period of time to implement.
Rachel, I want to stay with you for 2 comments and then go back to Jon. More than 400 IDF soldiers have died since 10/8. Many were murdered on 10/7 as well, but more than 400 have died in Gaza since 10/8. A resumption of the war means even more will die. So it is not something to be said lightly or for an American to say, do this, do that. I have no opinion on what happened. I want Israel to do what Israel wants to do. But I am surprised that very few people seem to know that they were shocked on Saturday. I think the reason is because we saw Gadi Moses come out, an 80-year-old man, and look like he had survived as well as anyone could have survived. But then the 3 hostages who were released on Saturday shocked us. But as you just mentioned, we ought not to have been shocked, correct?
Oh, I don't think that we should be shocked that the hostages are being tortured and starved. We now know from people who were in the war cabinet and in the defense echelon, who are saying, we knew then, we knew a year ago, the conditions, especially for certain hostages, is completely torturous. Starvation, being burned, being shackled, being held up by their feet, being gagged and bound, having no light, no sunlight in almost 500 days, some of them. Sometimes they go days without eating. Orlevy said on Saturday when he came home, he hadn't been bathed in months. This is not acceptable.
John, Ruthie Bloom was on the Commentary podcast this morning saying that in light of the President Trump's ultimatum, if they release 20 as opposed to 3, there's going to be a dilemma. I'm trying to anticipate various scenarios. What would your reaction be to that?
So I'm not sure what that means, release 20. I'm not hearing that is even a possibility. Although, again, in the world where we want to accelerate things, let me put some perspective around the numbers for a second. There were
Please.
251 hostages taken on October 7th. So roughly, in almost 500 days, 160 have been released in a variation of a negotiated settlement. 8 have been rescued through military operations. So when my focus is on getting out all of the remaining hostages, that's how I'm thinking about it. For the hostages to go back to war now, which is being threatened, would be devastating, let alone what Rachel said about the rest of the region. So if getting out 20 this weekend instead of 3 is some way to show that we're accelerating the releases, obviously I'm in favor. I don't know if you're talking about the conundrum of 20 and then for some reason things get stuck afterwards. But
Ruthie threw out 20 as being a midpoint between what they were supposed to do, what they had agreed to do, 3, and they've already breached the agreement in many different ways. But they were supposed to do 3 on Saturday, and the president says all or nothing now, so maybe they do a halfway point. Ruthie, by the way, I admire both of yours courage incredibly, because what you're doing in the middle of mourning Hersh is advocating for the other prisoners. And I'm sure my audience agrees with me that incredibly noble and inspiring, but hard. Last week, again from the Commentary podcast this morning, the Hamas leadership flew to Iran to meet with the supreme leader of that theocracy. And we don't know what was said there, but it seems clear to me Iran is pulling at least most of the strings on Hamas. Should any retribution for any failure to apply to the deal be applied at Iran or at the people of Gaza, Ruthie?
So, I mean, we've talked for 494 days about kind of follow the flow of the funds that's funding Hamas and that's giving them their guidance. And it's the country you talked about. Rachel and I have always said we are not strategists in the political realm. We're not politicians. So we've stayed out of suggesting any kind of policy decisions for Israel, for the US, or any of the mediators. We're here not just as people who are emotionally invested, but who have paid the heaviest price, as you mentioned, Hugh. And that's why we are still in it. We know what it feels like. We know what it is to be the victims of global diplomatic failure, I'll call it. The world let us down and so many of the other hostage families. We don't want any other families to go through that. In terms of how it's ultimately going to shake out in the region with Iran or any other proxy sponsors, I'm hopeful that there are political leaders who are going to figure that out, but that they're only going to prioritize that after we save all the lives that we can save right now that are so precarious.
And Hugh, we should also remind your listeners that we still have our youngest hostages, and they're hostages. They're not criminals. They're not prisoners. The 2 youngest are a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. I mean, this is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. And we have elderly hostages that have not been released yet, who are over 80 years old. I don't understand, where is the world? Where is the outrage? And as Jon mentioned, we still have 6 Americans being held, 2 that we know are alive, and 4 that we aren't 100% sure, but are assumed dead.
Yeah, Segui Dekel Chen is one of the 2 Americans we know for sure, or we think for sure is alive. His 3rd child was born during his hostage captivity. Rachel, the agony that you've gone through and that Jon have gone through and your family's gone through, how do you talk to the hostage families about that and about keeping hope alive even when you were so deeply wounded by hope not being delivered on?
I really, we are people of faith, and I actually say, thank God I believe in God, because we have had the ultimate blow, and in such a unique and shattering way, that it's hard to relate to people. But we were, for such a long period, part of the hostage family cohort who still had our loved one alive there. And we feel so connected to that community. And that's why we continue on this advocacy, plight, because we can't rest, and we can't actually continue forward until these people are home. We feel like the truck is still on us. It's moved, because it used to be on our chest. Now we're still pinned under it, but it's our leg.
I remember you used that analogy in our first conversation. I've never forgotten that. Jon, let me close this way. I'm very confident that National Security Advisor Walls and probably the president will see this video and hear this interview. Very, very confident. What do you want to say to President Trump that you are very confident he will hear?
So my message would be, of course, if everything were to break down and we had to, God forbid, resort to some kind of military action, Israel is prepared to do that. And it's clear that President Trump is prepared to give Israel the cover for that. But I implore every single person who has the ability to influence this to keep the negotiations and the deal as it's moving on track. Again, if we could accelerate it, because all the citizens of this region would benefit from an acceleration, then let's accelerate it. But the key is, let's not let the deal fall apart.
Jon Polin Rachel Goldberg-Polin, thank you again. We mourn with you, and I appreciate your coming on. Anytime you would like to come back, just let me know, and we will make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you
Go
so
with
much.
God. Bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.